Probably just a stepped over.
Oh, well, people have when people don't like that.
Maybe a step cramp or something.
Yeah. On an airplane.
Oh,
Go for it.
yes.
Yeah, I said it.
And then I'll call you in a second, John. Okay. Okay, and we have these on, so just unmute, that's all. Okay, I think we're unmuted in the meeting room in Washington DC, and everyone, hopefully, the lunch was okay. And I don't see anyone falling asleep after lunch, so that's good, because we have a very, very exciting speaker next. We've had a great morning, and we will continue the momentum this afternoon. In a moment, Professor Jonathan Deason will introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Phil Levin. But I wanted to just say a word about John. John and I met for the first time when he was director of the Office of Environmental Policy and Compliance at the U.S. Department of the Interior, a long time ago. And he is executive director in George Washington University of the Environmental and Energy Management Institute, and he's lead professor of the Environmental and Energy Management Graduate Program within George Washington University. Prior to this, he also was Vice President of Environmental Affairs at the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. He serves on a number of boards, American Water Resources, American Society of Civil Engineers, et cetera. But most important, and he didn't even want me to mention it, but I will, this morning, he was awarded by the Department of Engineering here at George Washington University the Distinguished Teaching Award for this year. So that is a big deal. So we congratulate you. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to John to introduce Phil Levin. And Phil, we are very much looking forward to your remarks.
All right, well, it's my pleasure to be a part of the program. I've been part of Barbara's programs for a long time, and they're wonderful, wonderful programs. Phil Levin is the director of the National Nature Assessment, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, the White House OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy. So that's really quite exciting. This is a new situation, apparently, that Phil is going to tell us about. So let me tell you a little bit about Phil. He got his BA degree in zoology from the University of Texas, his PhD in zoology from the University of New Hampshire in 1993, and also has served as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of North Carolina. Phil is a conservation scientist who works to bridge gaps between theory and practice, and especially between the science, the social, and the natural sciences. He's focused on interdisciplinary tools to inform conservation of marine, aquatic, and terrestrial ecosystems. Presently, Phil is on loan to the White House OSTP from his real job, which he's professor of practice, School of Marine and Environmental Affairs, and also the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at University of Washington. Prior to his present position at OSTP, Phil served as the lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy in Washington and was a senior scientist at NOAA Fisheries Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. Phil was the scientific lead of NOAA's Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Program, leading the development of new analytical tools for characterizing ecosystem health and forecasting the cumulative effects of coastal zone management and climate change on marine ecosystems. Phil received the Department of Commerce Silver Award and also NOAA's Bronze Medal for his work on marine ecosystems, and also the Seattle Aquarium's Conservation Research Award for his work in Puget Sound. Phil has published over 200 scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals, book chapters, and technical reports, and edited the recent book, Conservation of the Anthropocene Ocean, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Nature and People. Phil's work has been featured in such news outlets as NPR, PBS, New York Times, BBC, MSNBC, The Economist, and many others, actually. Phil has served as the president of the Western Society of Naturalists and on numerous additional boards and scientific advisory panels. The U.S. National Nature Assessment, which is assessing the status, trends, and future projections of America's lands, water, wildlife, biodiversity, and ecosystems, as well as the benefits they provide, including connections to the economy, public health, equity, climate mitigation, and adaptation, as well as national security. Work completed so far and plans going forward, as well as individuals and stakeholder groups that can be involved, include all of us. So please help me welcome Dr. Phil Levin.
Okay, I think I'm ready to go. Is that right? Or is there an echo?
You should be good, Dr. Levin. I just muted the main meeting room.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. I guess I wish I could be there with you, but unfortunately, fortunately, I'm at home in Vashon, Washington right now. And I'm really excited today to talk to you about the first ever National Nature Assessment. And we can start with the slides when you're ready. My contact information is here, and at the end, I'll also put up a QR code that links to our website. Please feel free to reach out to me. We are really interested in engaging you, your comments, your questions, and so please do reach out if you have anything you want to connect with us. And I'll go to the next slide, please. So really, it starts with just the breathtaking beauty of nature, the intricate ecosystems that we have, the diversity of those ecosystems, the adaptations, cycles, and patterns. I mean, it inspires awe in us, but it's more than just that. It fuels innovation. It provides us solace in improving mental health, which many of us found out, especially during COVID when we were locked down, there was nothing better than a walk outside. And I think nature generally teaches us valuable lessons, not only lessons, but also it fuels our economy. And we're just connected to nature in so many ways. At the same time, next slide, please. We know that nature is changing. We all see changes. Maybe it's the timing of flowers in the field that are changing, or the arrival of insects timing is slightly different. We have fewer pollinators than we used to. New invasive species are showing up. In many places, there's less water in rivers than there used to be. Sometimes there's more water in rivers than there used to be. And so things are changing. We see it, we know it, we feel it. And seeing these changes, next slide, please. We get that nature is essential. It's critical to our economy. It's critical to our lives. But there is a clear recognition that we can't achieve major national goals, be it around climate change or equity or jobs, unless we do more for nature. And we know this in broad brush strokes, but the reality is that we just don't have a complete comprehensive picture of what's happening with nature today in the US, how that matters today to us and to the future for our economy and our lives. Next slide, please. And so that led us led to the creation of the National Nature Assessment. The National Nature Assessment is going to be conducted by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. This is an entity that crosses 14 different agencies across the government. Each of these agencies have some connection to climate and the environment. So US GCRP is an entity that really coordinates all these efforts across the government. Next slide, please. The creation of the nature assessment actually happened in Earth Day 2022. It was initiated with an executive order where President Biden said, basically, thou shalt do an assessment of the condition of nature in the US. And that we have the authority to do this under the Global Change Research Act of 1990. Next slide, please. The initial scope of the NNA, as was mentioned, is super broad. It's to assess the status, trends, future projections of land, water, wildlife, diversity, ecosystems, and importantly, not just what's happening in nature, but also the benefits that nature provides. And so those benefits include our connections to the economy and health, also equity and climate, and national security. So the scope is really big. And in fact, I think too big for the first effort to actually tackle really well. And so part of what we had to do was to think about how do we narrow this down. Next slide, please. As we thought about how do we narrow it down, there were two basic principles that we wanted to keep in mind. First of all, we want this to be inclusive of all stakeholders, all parts of the country, everybody who has a connection to nature in different ways. And we also wanted to be use inspired. That is, we didn't want to generate a report that's going to sit on a shelf. We wanted to reach out to people and understand what they wanted to know, how they might use this information, what questions were really important to them, and then we can tailor this first report to meet those needs. Next slide, please. The other thing that's really important about what we're doing is we recognize that there's lots of different ways that people connect to and know nature. Importantly, this includes indigenous knowledge, and we recognize that indigenous knowledge is a really important body of knowledge that can contribute to our understanding of the natural world and therefore to this report. Next slide. And so what we started with was really just trying to understand what do people want. That included a Federal Register notification with a request for information, where we got 3,000 comments. We then engaged formally with Native Hawaiian communities and tribes, and then we conducted public events that reached over 130 different organizations across the US. And so this gave us at least the beginning of an understanding of what people were interested in, what would be useful. Next slide. And the result of those engagements over several months was to develop a prospectus which centered on 4 key themes: conservation and natural resource management, the economy, health and well-being, and safety and security, with 2 overriding themes that cross-cut these 4 bins, climate change and equity. And what I'll do now is go into a little bit of depth in each of these sections. And what I'm going to show you here are a series of questions that are sort of mashups of all the input we got from a variety of stakeholders. So the first is around conservation and natural resource management. Here, people really want to know just the basics. What's happening with the status, trends, and drivers of change of anything affecting species and ecosystems across the US. So that's sort of really the basic first order question that you have to address. I think more uniquely for us, there was a whole bunch of input that we got that really focused on access to nature. So the premise is it's great to have nature, but if you don't have access to it, either in cities or in rural areas, then you don't get the benefits from it. So how has access to nature changed over time? Who's getting the benefits, and what can we do to improve access to nature? Similarly, people were interested in culturally significant species and ecosystems. So across the country, people are connected to species and ecosystems in very important different ways. You can't go to Maine and not think about lobsters, or in my part of the world, it's salmon. We're connected to nature in lots of different ways, and it impacts us socially and culturally. So how is that changing? And what are ways that options for us to improve the abundance of these culturally significant species? Next slide, please. Of course, people were interested in the economy and the importance of nature to the economy. So this includes us addressing questions like how many jobs are dependent on nature, and how changes in nature affected jobs and livelihoods, and what aspects of the economy are connected to status and trends of nature, and what might we do in the future to advance the economy while also providing benefits to nature and climate. And as we invest in infrastructure and economic development, how can we do that in a way that generates the most benefits for the least harm? Next slide. The third bin is focused around health and well-being. And here it's, in a sense, the questions are fairly straightforward. So how have changes in nature impacted physical, mental health and health disparities? And what are some options that we can use to reduce health risks for all people? It really forces us, though, to think about what is health, what is well-being. And there's lots of different frameworks to think about this. And of course, we'll engage the medical and public health communities in this regard, but also in the spirit of being inclusive and thinking about multiple ways of knowing, there's different ways to think about health, for example. Next slide. One example of this is work done up here in the Pacific Northwest by Jamie Donatuto with the Swinomish tribe, who really focused in this NIH-funded project on a variety of indigenous health indicators. So these are health metrics that were defined by the community. So the community was asked, when you think about your health, what are things that we should look at? So this goes beyond the typical things that we might think about in terms of physical health or mental health, to include intergenerational transfer of knowledge, connections of the community to each other and to nature, to the ability to have self-determination and access to cultural resources. Next slide. And there's also different ways to think about well-being beyond, again, just thinking about physical or mental health. It includes the connections that's similar to the indigenous health indicators, but also our ability to just lost my train of thought. Our agency, our ability to control our own destiny, have access to knowledge and technology, sense of control, and a variety of other metrics that go beyond just sort of the way we might typically think of health and well-being. So the point being that as we begin and think about nature and health connections, we're going to have to think about this from a broad perspective, I think. Next slide. And the last bin focuses on safety and security. And here there's two general areas. The first is natural environmental hazards. We can see that these are increasing over time as a consequence of lots of changes from climate or changes in the natural environment. So we're asking what losses from hazards could have been averted by nature, and how did this impact different people in different places? And how can we think about nature-based solutions as a way to reduce risk from these environmental hazards? And the second general bin in this area is around food and water security. So either in the case of industrial commercial agriculture, you can think about changes in pollinators and the impact of that on food production. Likewise, for those who rely on subsistence foods, there's different ways in which changes in nature are impacting their food security. So what's happening in that regard, and what are opportunities for us to avert emerging security and water risks? Next slide, please. So we will, of course, generate a report that's based on these questions. So these, again, are key questions that are coming from different user interests and identified through our past engagement and ongoing engagement. But in addition to the report, we're working on a variety of other products. These are still in early phases of development. The idea with these is that, and we heard this over and over again, that there's a huge diversity of perspectives, and we want to be able to capture that. And we heard over and over again that people want to express their varying perspectives in their own voices, not filtered through a report or through scientists, but in their own voices. So we're engaged now in exploring a number of different ways to do this. I think it will generate some compelling narratives and highlight through people's own voices, how they're experiencing nature and nature's changes. Next slide, please. And so what I would like to do is close by just basically highlighting 3 questions that we asked a lot of people, and I'd love to get your take on some of these as well if we have time. The first is, what does nature mean to you? How do you connect to nature? What is nature even? Next slide. What topics would it be most valuable for us in the National Nature Assessment to address? And finally, next slide. What sort of products can best communicate the findings that we will generate? Next slide, please. The QR code here will take you to our website. The website will, maybe on Friday, I hope, have a published Federal Register notice that will be a call for authors and technical contributions. So please keep a lookout for that. If you want more information, sign up for our mailing list or lean in and contribute to the project itself. So this will be coming out any day now. We're in the process of using additional inputs, such as comments that we hear from you all, to help develop detailed author guidance. So these are broad questions that we're tackling. And so what sort of guidance should we give authors that helps them hone in and fine tune their work? And we're working on that now, and so your input's very valuable there. We'll be building and onboarding author teams in the winter into the spring. We anticipate having about 150 or so authors and then additional contributors beyond that. And those authors will work to generate, by late spring, a first draft, which is really just going to be a detailed outline. That outline will go out for comment. in the Federal Register, it'll be refined, and then people will work together to produce a final draft by the end of 2026. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of our timeline. It's a huge task with a pretty short timeline. And thanks for your attention. I'll stop there and be happy to entertain any questions you might have. Thanks.
I think that, well, those mics aren't on. Yeah, okay. So the questions that you asked, Phil, and by the way, it's such a, oops, unmute. Okay. Yeah, so the questions that you asked, what is nature, what does it mean to you, the topics, et cetera, I think if we went around the room, that would be really interesting, but we don't have the time to do that. But that would be a real fun focus session for us, actually, because we are all dealing with nature and natural resources. They're kissing cousins, if not the same. We can certainly entertain some questions. I had one question and then turn over to John to ask his questions and see if we have questions in the room. It seems that this will amass a great body of information. And the question that I have is, once that information is amassed and once the different viewpoints and the different input, what does that say about what we will need to do as a country? And is that viewed to be a secondary issue? For example, it would seem also that it would be married to certain objectives that already exist. For example, U.S. Department of Interior, cordoning off certain resources, Forest Service, some of these preservation kinds of issues, conservation issues, as well as some of the more personal side of this. So once the report is put together, which seems to be an explication of all these different aspects of nature, is there an action agenda that is envisioned to come from this, would be my question. And who would undertake that?
Thanks. I think you might have to mute.
Oh, we might have to mute. Okay, just mute it.
Okay. Yeah, I get it goes. I think because I'm on the speaker over there, kind of reverberates.
I'm running
over
my
here.
next meeting on Mars.
So two aspects to your question. One is we are explicitly not policy prescriptive. So our goal is to generate information that's policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And what that means in the context of your question is through our activities, we've gone out and identified with agencies specific questions or needs that they have. Some of them are related, for example, you mentioned DOI and maybe the 30 by 30 effort, which you might have been referencing in America Beautiful initiative. So our work would obviously kind of feed into that as well. I think beyond that, we have the advantage of working with these 14 agencies, each of which has their own mission and their own priorities. And so by focusing on both the stakeholder needs and the agency needs, we're generating information that feeds into ongoing initiatives by these different organizations, each of which are involved in different ways. FEMA, for example, thinking about different ways that they can use nature-based solutions to mitigate environmental hazards. Or likewise, DOD and others are pretty interested in how we might generate products from the nature assessment to help streamline and make dealing with NEPA issues more efficient. And so there's a number of different areas where we could land. Right now, the door is pretty open as we begin to fine tune our content, and then work with those agencies to find areas where they could inform what's going on. But again, without the explicit direct, like there's not a line from here's a result, here is an action by an agency. Instead, it's really meant to inform and start a dialogue.
Okay, I just unmuted for a second. Follow-up question, is there a industry advisory group to this at all that's been established?
There is, we have not done that. And that's, would be an interesting thing to do.
I'll help.
It's probably worth saying that, you know, I've been on the job for, I think, 6 months or so. So we're new, we're getting organized, and again, we really appreciate the diversity of input and perspectives. It's really helpful to us to generate products that are the most useful to all people.
Okay, let's open this up for other questions from Jonathan or from the audience where,
Yeah, in my teaching, what I usually do is save mine for last. I do have some burning questions, but let me open it up to the audience first and see what questions we have.
First, we have chat function for those who are online, and Tara will, I think you've got some chats, Tara. Do you want to handle those? And then how many people in the room have questions here, the meeting room? Okay.
I do.
Yeah, Jonathan does. Do you want to go for the chat, Tara?
I don't see any questions in the questions.
You don't? Okay, then I'm going to let, I don't know where Jonathan went, where Phil went. Okay, I'm going to unmute and,
Okay.
or no, you're going to speak, so go ahead.
Yeah. So Phil, there are a number of international environmental assessment programs, one of which I think sprung from Agenda 21. That was a product of the World Summit in Rio in 1992. They have this global environmental outlook process. Right now, the current version is GEO6, and they're working on GEO7. To what extent does your effort feed into these international global environmental assessments?
Yeah, thanks. There's a number of efforts going on. And particularly, I think the one that will be most tied to is the IPBES process, which is sort of the IPCC analog for biodiversity. And in that case, because that the US part of that is run through USGS, the same people who are engaged with IPBES are also involved directly in our assessment. So there's this hardwired connection between the two. And we're learning a lot of lessons from what they've done. And that's part of the reason why what we're doing is shaping up sort of in this question-driven, user-driven framework so that it doesn't duplicate efforts of the global agencies, and instead takes that information and hones it and shapes it into a thing that directly addresses stakeholder questions. So we're related to a lot of the international efforts and trying not to duplicate them. And I would say the other topic related to international is in our group of agencies is the State Department and USAID, both of which are really interested in environmental issues that are international. And there are two things that come up in our discussions with them. One is the process that we are using to do and create this assessment is something that's of interest to USAID in a number of their settings. So what are lessons that other nations can learn regarding the way we are doing things, how we are incorporating indigenous knowledge, for example, which has this whole set of hurdles that are sort of built into government processes. And the second area that's of interest to State Department and USAID involves migratory species. and how global drivers as change impact what's happening with those species here and abroad, and how actions that we have here in the US impact those species and the benefits they give to other countries.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Phil. Second question is, a lot of us here, me included, really haven't experienced the NNA until we heard you speak. And so one question would be, how can we help? Now, Barbara has asked about an industry group. She's willing to help, apparently. And you mentioned author teams. You mentioned 150 authors. How do we volunteer, or how will you solicit assistance from the national community? How can we get involved?
Yeah, so the QR code I showed at the end, which just essentially takes you to our website, which is globalchange.gov. We'll have a specific place for, I think it will be Friday, the way things are looking now, for individuals to nominate themselves or others to be directly engaged as authors or technical contributors to the project itself. And so that's a really great way if you have a perspective that you would like to see drawn out. Especially, I think, in this first one, our scope is so big and there's so many different directions we could go. The author team will have a big role in triaging that and really focusing in on things that we can do in this first one and do well. So I think volunteering as an author or a lighter touch is something we call technical contributor would be an area that would be really good for people to think about if they can. I really like the idea of having some sort of group that we could connect with periodically and provide feedback. We'll provide updates and then get feedback in our direction. And I'm happy to pursue that and generate some meetings at some interval that makes sense, quarterly or twice a year or something like that. And happy to talk about that moving forward.
Okay,
I can be in touch on that following this meeting. I wanted to ask one other question. Are there models that have been identified, similar studies by other countries? In other words, either in Europe or other continents that, typically on something like this, the question is, are there parallel track experiences that are relevant? And so I'm just curious as to whether you've identified Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, well, not Hawaii, but other countries who might have undertaken this, and in some cases maybe in connection with military and national security operations. I don't know, anyway, question.
Yeah, there are a few other similar flavor assessments in other countries. We're assembling those now. I think there's one in the UK that's quite similar. Australia has one that's similar. The difference, I would say, is they really focus on biodiversity. So they're called biodiversity assessments.
Mm-hmm.
We are a little bit different in that we specifically did not use the word biodiversity. So we're thinking about nature broadly speaking, and everybody sort of has a different definition of nature, and how they connect to nature is quite differently. So our work will be a little bit broader and more focused on benefits that nature delivers rather than just trends in nature itself. And the other one that's relevant for us is New Zealand has an assessment where they've done quite a bit of work integrating Indigenous knowledge in their products. And so that's, there are lessons for us to learn from that one and how to do that. We have, there's a number of issues that come up for us in incorporating Indigenous knowledge, particularly around FOIA. So if people want to provide Indigenous knowledge that may be confidential, for example, the fact that it is in a government report could make it FOIA-able, and then we run into all sorts of intellectual property issues. And so that's an area where I think, just from a process standpoint, we have a lot to learn and to potentially contribute to other assessments going forward.
Okay, thank you for that answer. John, we have probably time for one last question.
Well, let me invite the audience to pose the last question.
Tara, any
If-
chats
yeah,
there?
If not, I will hog it.
Let me just see. Tara, any chats? Because I see chats here on this screen I'm looking at, but
Okay,
presumably,
I think that
We have a
might be
question, Barbara,
conversation
right?
back and forth.
I see.
Barbara, we
Okay.
have a question.
Oh, question, okay. Can we get a, whoops, one of the mics that, there you are. Bring that over there. You got challenged here.
That's okay. I prefer that.
Hi, Dr. Levin. I'm Ryan Stifter. I'm with RU. I had a question. You said that the assessment is going to focus on more the benefits of natural resources and nature, or just nature. Are you anticipating putting dollar values on some of those benefits or quantifying them more in physical terms or physical units?
Yeah, that's a great question. It actually integrates, your question integrates well with some of the other activities that are happening in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, particularly around natural capital accounting. So that information is information that we will take advantage of as we move forward and integrate into our products. Exactly the degree that we monetize things is going to be up to the author teams in some regards. In other words, we want them to be empowered, put forward the best products that they feel is reasonable for their subject matter. So I think in some areas we'll see that. My guess is things around health, for example, we might not. And it depends on each sector is a little bit more or less advanced in that regard. And there's various pitfalls that happen in different sectors as well. And so I think that's going to be left to the author teams so that they're bringing forward the best and most rigorous science that's available. And that's not a very satisfactory answer, I know.
It'll have to do for now. I think, one more question and then we wrap it up, or are you okay?
Well, do we have other questions?
We have any other questions?
I do have
One
several others,
short
but I can ask
question?
one. Well,
This is
are we
the
unmuted?
last,
Okay. I think we
yes,
are.
last question.
So, Phil, I know you're not policy prescriptive in the study, but what about, we have incidents all the time, like we have, still the United States has a lot of.
I think
oil.
unfortunately, this mic in the room might be a little staticky.
Phil, can you hear? Apparently not.
Can you hear us?
Looks
We
like.
can, but
looks
it's
like
very
he's-
staticky.
Looks like he's frozen. Is he frozen? No, I guess not. Well, perhaps we should wrap it up.
Okay, I think that the technology is telling us we need to move to the next agenda item. Thank you so very much, Phil, if you can still hear us, for an excellent presentation. Very fascinating effort, huge. I don't know how you sleep at night. This is a big, big responsibility, but looking forward to trying to provide some really constructive input. So I will be in touch, and others here too will now take the QR code and get tied in to see what you're all about in more detail too. So we thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and that website's globalchange.gov. And do feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or comments. I'm happy to exchange ideas over email. Have a great afternoon there.